We recognized that being strong at home was essential. We also need to be strong overseas. And I think this is really core to President Biden's own personal worldview, is that we're strongest when we work with allies and partners, and that this is an advantage that the United States has that our competitors, our adversaries, simply do not.
Welcome to So What's the Strategy? I'm your host, Matthew Kroenig. Today we're going to discuss the national security strategies of the Biden administration and the Trump 2.0 administration. We'll take a look back to Biden's approach to world affairs and also evaluate Trump's emerging approach to global issues. Joining me today is Dr. Rebecca Lissner. She's a senior fellow for U.S. foreign policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. I wanted to talk to Rebecca because she has a wealth of experience working on and studying American grand strategy. I first met Rebecca years ago when she was a PhD student at Georgetown University. And since then, she's gone on to do many impressive things. She's published 3 books. She helped craft the Biden-Harris national security strategy when she worked on the National Security Council staff in the Biden administration. Most recently, she served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Principal Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris, where she continued to advise White House leadership on national security and strategic issues, ranging from Russia's war in Ukraine to artificial intelligence. So as you can see, she's highly qualified to talk to us today about grand strategy and what she's seeing in the second Trump administration. Former National Security Advisor General Brent Scowcroft used to challenge his team with a simple question. So what's the strategy? What do you want to do? And how are you going to do it? That's the focus of this show. On So What's the Strategy, we talk with senior government officials and leading experts about the strategies for addressing the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. Let's get started. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Matt.
So as you know, we're going to look back at Biden's national security strategy approach to the world, look ahead to Trump's national security strategy. But let's first maybe start with the biographical question, if we could. You participated in the production of the Biden national security strategy. What was that process like?
Well, it was a long process, let me tell you, Matt. We started off actually during the transition from the first Trump term to Biden and started to think about what was the core strategic logic that should guide President Biden's foreign policy. And that early discussion was actually really important because it served as a means of aligning the incoming team around a theory of the case. So that document traveled into the administration with us when we came in January of 2021 and ultimately became the interim national security strategic guidance that came out in the early months of President Biden's term. That laid out, I think, and laid the foundation for a lot of what came next. It was also really important because it came early. So it provided critical guidance to departments and agencies who were undergoing, frankly, some whiplash between a Trump administration, the types of policies they pursued, the types of processes they used, and what the incoming Biden team wanted to do. And now remember, this was in the middle of a pandemic where it was really hard to convene people in person. So I think that's a critically important part of the story, that early guidance. And as you know well, above all, the Pentagon really needs that kind of written guidance from the commander-in-chief in order to execute on a lot of what they wanted to do. But then after releasing the interim national security strategic guidance, we kicked off a year-plus long process to draft a full national security strategy in line with the congressional mandate. And it had a lot of different phases. In the early phases, we took a hard look at that interim strategic guidance. We had the intelligence community red team it. What did we get right? What did we get wrong? How were events changing in such a way that might have implicated the logic and the theory that we put forward in that early document? We consulted a really wide range of stakeholders. We held expert dialogues on any number of specific foreign policy topics, but we also brought in non-traditional stakeholders. We talked to labor, we talked to philanthropies, we talked to mayors. We really wanted to understand how the strategic outlook appeared to a number of different people. And then, of course, we ran an interagency process. We got together the strategy folks from around the government, from all the key pieces and components who think about strategy to talk over and over about what are the principles, what are we trying to do, what's the world that we want to see. And we spent a lot of time with the National Security Advisor and the senior national security team at the White House, really understanding what it was the president wanted to drive in the strategy. And then, of course, we drafted. And as you know, these government strategy documents have many, many authors. So there were thousands of track changes, many comments that had to be considered and incorporated and adjudicated. But I think what was unique and also challenging about the national security strategy drafting process in the Biden administration is we actually had a fully completed strategic document by January of 2022. But the problem was that we also knew that Russia was about to invade Ukraine, and it didn't make a lot of sense to put out a decisive and authoritative strategic statement of intent right on the eve of something that seemed sure to be a tectonic geopolitical event. And so we held on that document. We waited, we watched, we saw. I ultimately left my role at the NSC and went on to work for the vice president. And so it was a different team that finally took it across the finish line. But the final months were really about trying to make sure that the final national security strategy document reflected the world as we saw it at a time of considerable crisis and upheaval.
That's great. And I think it's really smart that you did that interim national security guidance because, as you just pointed out, it takes a year often to get the national security strategy. And meanwhile, the bureaucracies are waiting for guidance. So getting that out quickly, I think, was important. And I advised my friends in the Trump 2.0 to do that. And the Pentagon did get out an interim defense strategy, but the NSC did not get out an interim national security strategy document. I think the way you did it was the right one. And I do want to come back.
I think it should become standard practice, frankly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are two ways to think about it. One is you just put out an interim document as quickly as you can early and sort of use the transition to start to pull it together. Another thing is just to think about the national security strategy itself differently. And maybe that document should be shorter, quicker, come out sooner, and be more prospective rather than what it often ends up being when it comes out a year plus into the administration, which is reflective of the policy that has already emerged as much as it is sort of channeling where the administration intends to go from there.
That's interesting. So just get out the short piece in March, and that's the NSS, and move on. If I could take you back, so early 2021, what were the big strategic challenges the incoming Biden administration saw, and remind us of what we were dealing with in early 2021?
It's easy to forget what a challenging time that felt like and how there seemed to be at the time multiple compounding crises that we were coming in and having to grapple with all at the same time. First and foremost, of course, was the pandemic. This was a time where, scores of Americans were still dying every single day from COVID, and the need to address that urgent crisis, its knock-on effects as it related to the economy, people's health, but also to think about how that could become a galvanizing force for rethinking the global health security architecture. That was certainly front of mind. And of course, there were all kinds of questions about vaccine distribution globally, how to do it, where to do it, vaccine diplomacy, and so on. So that, it's easy to forget where we were there, but I think that was a really important issue. A second one that was absolutely top of mind was China. And, this is a place where we can talk about this present Trump term on China, but the first Trump administration did execute an important strategic pivot in its focus on great power competition. And the Biden team came in, and in a lot of ways, I think we embraced some of the core thesis that President Trump had put forward in his China policy, but also set about to do it better. And so, yes, there needed to be competition with China, and that was the call to action. But we really wanted to revitalize our alliances so that it wasn't just the United States competing with China, but we could really leverage our unrivaled network of alliances and partnerships, which had been severely battered in the first Trump administration, mobilize those better. Another piece of the China competition agenda, of course, was domestic investment. And so this is another place where there is intersection between the international and the domestic. But we also set out to put forth a domestic agenda that would shore up the foundations of U.S. competitiveness in such a way that would position us to outcompete China over the long run.
That makes sense. And then, so what was the strategy for addressing those challenges, not just as laid out in the document, but looking back at the 4 years with the crisis management, the policy, the document? How would you characterize the Biden strategy, and is there a Biden doctrine?
Yeah, so I think in a way, actually, the national security strategy does sum it up quite well, right? We set out to invest in and restore the sources of American strength, both at home and abroad, so that we could exert that strength in shaping a world that was free, open, secure, and prosperous, the kind of world that we wanted to see. And if you look back at the track record of the Biden administration, I think it's quite good. And I don't just say that because I sat at the White House for 4 years, but there was considerable legislative activity. There was, the pandemic era recovery bill. There was the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. All of these were generationally consequential and large pieces of legislation that really advanced the domestic competitiveness agenda, often in a bipartisan way, but not always, across a number of different key areas that were really vital to 21st century competition, like clean energy, like chips and technology, and so on. But at the same time, we recognize that being strong at home was essential. We also need to be strong overseas. And the Biden theory of the case, and I think this is really core to President Biden's own personal worldview, is that we're strongest when we work with allies and partners, and that this is an advantage that the United States has that our competitors, our adversaries, simply do not. And so there was a lot of time spent in really investing in shoring up NATO. Of course, we saw large increases in defense spending by the alliance over the course of Biden's 4 years. We added 2 new members to the alliance and really sort of left NATO much stronger than we found it. Also, significant investment in Indo-Pacific alliances, including taking the sort of hub and spokes network of Indo-Pacific allies and starting to network them more closely together through initiatives like elevating the Quad to the leader level, through initiatives like a trilateral between Japan, South Korea, and the US, and so on. And so those were sort of the two key pieces, and then using those in order to uphold the rules-based international order that the Biden administration, I think, really felt was essential to creating the kind of world that the United States wanted to live in, the kind of world that would keep Americans safe, secure, and prosperous.
So you've already started to answer this question, but looking back, how effective was the strategy? And here at the Scowcroft Center, we publish these strategy scorecards where we put on our professor hats and give a strategy a grade from A to F. And so, yeah, how effective was the Biden strategy? So
what did we get?
I think at the time I gave you a B, and I'd have to go back and look. I thought overall it was good. I really like the theme of linking together free world allies. I agree that's one of our greatest strengths. Can't remember my criticism of the document at the time, and I'll maybe get to some of my criticisms of the execution of the strategy in a bit. But I'd be interested in your grade first.
Yeah, I give us a high grade, frankly. Of course, not perfect, and I think that there are places where more attention might have been warranted. But overall, when you think about the magnitude, again, of crisis that was President Biden's inheritance and the incredibly strong hand across multiple regions that he handed off to President Trump, I think that says a lot about the virtues of the strategy and also the focus and competence that the team brought to its execution.
Any regrets, or looking back, what is you think the biggest mistake the Biden team made, or if President Biden and Kamala Harris could go back and do something over, what do you think they would want to do over?
I mean, look, I think the biggest thing that always challenges those of us who are in the strategy business is crisis, right? The world gets a vote. And so I think that if you had gone entirely off of the national security strategy, for example, you would have expected the administration to focus the vast majority of its time on the Indo-Pacific. And there was significant progress made strategically in that region. But again, the world gets a vote. And so we had to deal with Russia's unprovoked and brutal invasion of Ukraine. We had to deal with Hamas's horrific attack on Israel on October 7th and all of the upheaval that came after it. And so crisis management did sometimes crowd out our ability to do affirmative strategy. I don't think that that's unique to the Biden administration. I think that's just a feature of America as a global power that has interests and friends and allies all around the world. But I do think that was absolutely a factor. And when you are grading the execution of the strategy, one would need to take that into account.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because that would have been, I think, my major criticism of the execution, and not unique to the Biden administration. I think every administration since at least Obama has been wanting to do less in Europe and the Middle East in order to focus on Indo-Pacific, and then those regions keep throwing up these nasty security challenges, war in Ukraine, October 7th, and so on. My team actually just pulled up my scorecard, so it was a B plus.
Oh, good staff work.
Yeah, B plus, and I said
B
on the
plus. All right, I'll take it.
I said on the
Matt
negative side.
And I were chatting earlier about the fact that he was one of my grad school professors, so I will very much take a B plus from Matt Kroenig, and would argue that we deserve better.
Well, I think you got an A in the classroom. It must have been those thousands of other people doing the edits that brought the grade down. But I said on the negative side, there's a potential gap between ambition and resources. The strategy prioritizes amorphous global challenges over concrete security threats. Too optimistic about cooperation with China. And the section on strengthening the United States for strategic competition includes too many divisive political issues. That was my assessment at the time.
I think that speaks to some of the other kind of important strategic innovations that are worth highlighting, not just about the document, but about the Biden administration approach. I mean, like I said, there was a core view that you can't be strong abroad if you're not strong at home. And so that did mean that a lot of domestic policy issues, economic policy issues, and frankly, political issues. And remember, this was also, we came in the wake of January 6th. I mean, that all very much became part of the story about how do you restore America's strength. So breaking down those silos between foreign and domestic policy was a really important part of it. And the other piece, which, your criticism raises, is this idea that we cannot choose between either doing great power competition or strategic competition, as we called it, or tackling transnational challenges. We have to do both. And part of our strategy was developing a theory for how actually, in an additive sense, you can do both, because the climate crisis is real. The pandemic was real. The food security crisis was real. I mean, those were all things that had to be addressed for reasons that were strategic and implicated U.S. interests, but that couldn't lead to a preference for cooperation that crowded out the very serious differences that we do have with countries like China. And so I actually think that the Biden administration deserves pretty strong marks. The China policy had various chapters and iterations, but overall, I do think that we set out a new framework, which was that we weren't going to either cooperate or compete. We were going to take those competitive actions that were required by American security, things like export controls. We were going to collaborate with our allies in order to shore up the balance of power, frankly, in our favor, but also where there were opportunities, and frankly, they were narrow, but where there were narrow opportunities to work with Beijing on areas of mutual interest, we were going to explore those as well. And we weren't going to forswear diplomacy entirely because the stakes are just too high.
Okay, let's turn to Trump's strategy now. And I would argue that no matter who came to office, whether it was Harris or Trump or somebody else, would be entering a dangerous moment in world history. How do you see the challenges facing the United States and its allies at this moment?
Yeah, I completely agree. We are at a dangerous moment in world history. I think just to start with the opportunity, the United States remains immensely powerful. We're the most powerful country in the world. And so that endows us with a lot of opportunities to shape the future. But it's nevertheless the case that the overall balance of power over the course of the past several decades has shifted in relative terms in ways that are not strictly advantageous to us and our allies and partners. And so that means that the China challenge, which is probably the defining geopolitical issue of this century, remains very salient. We have a China that is building up its military, that is expanding its influence in the region, particularly speaking about the Trump policy as the United States has retreated in some meaningful ways. We have a China-Russia no limits partnership that was forged on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that has powered Russia's war machine over the years that have followed. So that is a global geopolitical outlook that is incredibly challenging at the same time as we have these transnational issues that do require concerted action and do require collective action. And so, climate was one that deserved and got a lot of attention in the Biden administration. If I were to say what is another that is vastly challenging would have been for Harris is for Trump is AI. Like, we are on the precipice of really significant changes, I believe, that are coming as a result of artificial intelligence. And we're not ready in our country. The international system isn't ready. There's no global non-proliferation regime as it relates to AI or means of governing AI safety. And so that's another area where no matter who had won the last election, they would have had to find a way to advance some kind of global cooperation there. And again, doing that against the backdrop of a sort of competitive outlook that was getting worse and worse.
So what about Trump's strategy for addressing this? Does he have a coherent strategy that you see as either laid out in the NSS or through the day-to-day crisis management? How would you describe the Trump approach?
I don't think he has a coherent strategy because I would be hard-pressed to outline a theory of the case that helps me predict what the president will do in any given circumstance. I repeatedly find myself confounded in my predictions about what will come next. What I do think we see is certain proclivities that have been pretty constant over time. And these are pretty well known at this point. We know that the president has always felt allies are giving the United States a raw deal, that they're free riders. And so the antipathy towards allies, and especially European allies, is something that has been consistent over a very long time, probably even before President Trump ever considered running for president. Similarly, we know that free trade has long been a grievance for the president. He thinks that the American people have gotten, again, a raw deal from free trade and has always been interested, has long been interested in tariffs as a tool to try to address some of those challenges. And of course, he's particularly focused on deficits. And then the third is admiration for dictators and autocrats. And frankly, we increasingly see this in the way the president is governing domestically, but he's always had a certain affinity, maybe even bordering on sort of an envy for strong men leaders who seem to be able to unilaterally dictate outcomes. And so to me, those are the most stable elements of the president's worldview. Now, of course, there's elaborate strategic explanations that have come out recently, whether in the national security strategy and the national defense strategy. I think those channel President Trump in places, but they're also consensus documents that clearly reflect the views of a number of different factions within the administration, not always in a way that is entirely coherent. And so the best we can do, I think, in terms of trying to predict what the president might do next and what is the core logic is look to those three things. But the idea that American force can be wielded in a targeted, surgical way that is decisive, and then we pivot, that is something that Vice President Vance and others have described as the Trump doctrine as it relates to the use of force. And it seems like, particularly in the wake of the Venezuela operation, snatch and grab Maduro, I think the president himself believes that too. And so that does have the potential to be a kind of self-reinforcing logic that the president continues to turn to in the application of U.S. military power overseas.
It's an interesting point, and in a way reminds me of the Weinberger doctrine in the 1980s of being reluctant to use force, but if you're going to do it, have a clear kind of strategy of victory and do it in an overwhelming way, but wanting to avoid getting bogged down in long, drawn-out nation-building campaigns. So I guess I see it a little bit as a return to maybe the way Republican presidents used to think of it. But so sounds like critical of the Trump approach, or maybe astrategic in your view. But so what grade would you give the Trump strategy so far in this first year? And what about the biggest successes? Are there any successes of the first year of the Trump 2.0 administration from your point of view?
Yeah. The grade is tough. I mean, I struggle to give the president a passing grade, because I think that even where there are narrow successes, the net structural effects over the medium to long term of what this administration is doing, both at home and abroad, are going to be immensely damaging to American power. And my friend and co-author Mira Rapp-Hooper and I wrote recently in the New York Times that if you look at President Trump's foreign policy, it amounts to something like superpower suicide, because he and his team are systematically taking aim at an international order that was not perfect, but that the United States did build largely to advance the interests of ourselves and our allies, and was still delivering returns to us. But as Secretary Rubio has said, their view is that that order is not just obsolete, but a weapon that is being used against us. So they're about to dismantle that order, whether it comes to dismantling the trading order, whether it comes to weakening our alliances. And also, you have to look at the domestic picture. I just think that's a critical piece of it. Like, the United States has been so successful over so many decades, even against, many naysayers and predictions to the contrary, in large part because we have a vibrant democracy, because we're able to attract talent from around the world, because the US dollar is the global reserve currency, because we have strong rule of law, because of the independence of the Federal Reserve, because we have deep capital markets where people around the world think they can safely stash their money. And systematically, all of those things have been called into question just over the course of the first year of the Trump administration. And so we don't even know yet what's coming over the next 3 years. And so are there narrow successes? Yes. Do I think the president is testing interesting hypotheses about the use of American power that may subvert the way we thought things worked and could lead to doing different things in the future? Yes, I do. And I think those are important. But in aggregate, this foreign policy approach is incredibly damaging.
So final question, there'll be a new president in 2029. They'll need a new strategy. You might even be writing it. What would be your advice to the next president in terms of their grand strategy, and where should they go from here?
I think the most important thing to recognize is that there's no going back to the way things were before after this Trump presidency. And so whoever comes next, whether it's a more traditional Republican, whether it's a Democrat, needs to resist the impulse either to just try to reverse and undo everything the president has done for political or other reasons, or to try to put the pieces back together and restore something that approximates the foreign policy that President Biden left with in January of 2025. So we need a new approach. And there's a lot that's interesting and exciting there. I mean, this is probably the closest thing to a blank slate that we have had as a matter of American strategy and as a matter of global order since World War II. And so there are huge opportunities, I think, to, again, capitalize on America's still very considerable power that we have and turn it towards better uses. And, in many cases, I think we can approach this humbly and even, with an eye to the things, to your point, that the president has done well, and ask, in what cases has President Trump asked the right questions, right? Ask the question of why haven't we been able to get our NATO allies to spend more on defense? Ask the question of whether we have been using our world-class military in the best way. Ask the question of why we haven't been giving more priority, in particular to Latin America, given the importance to the American people of issues like migration, like crime, like drugs. So those are all important questions that we need to profoundly grapple with. My view is that his answers to those questions are almost universally wrong, but the opportunity for the next president will be to come up with better answers and put it together in a strategic construct that really speaks to the American people and also speaks to the urgency of the geopolitical moment that we find ourselves in.
Well, Rebecca, this has been a fascinating and insightful conversation, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Rebecca offers an authoritative perspective on Biden's foreign policy and a Democratic critique of the Trump 2.0 approach. As listeners might expect, I'm somewhat more sympathetic to what the Trump administration is trying to do. They're dealing with a challenging international security environment, from the risk of simultaneous conflict to a new technology revolution to addressing popular concerns about the excesses of globalization, and I do think they're putting in place some effective strategies to address these issues. And these are challenges that we're going to continue to unpack on future episodes of So What's the Strategy? This concludes our episode. Thank you all for listening. And be sure to subscribe to So What's the Strategy wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Matthew Kroenig, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.